Hi, this is Sam Gruber for CSP, and thank you for joining me on another journey to one of my favorite Jewish buildings, places, or spaces. Today, we're going to the Czech Republic, and we're going to be in the southeast part of the country in Moravia, and we're going to visit the town, the former Jewish quarter, and especially the Synagogue Maior, the great synagogue in Boskovice. Boskovice is about a few hours south of Prague, and you may not get there without intent, but I recommend the visit, and I hope that after this tour, you'll be ready to go. Boskovice is about a 3-hour drive southeast of Prague. It's a little north of the Moravian capital city of Brno, famous for its old and especially modern architecture. Boskovice is in the center of a beautiful area of the country, surrounded by towns, almost all of which have significant Jewish sites. So you can go to the Czech Republic and skip the glories of Prague and drive from town to town and see old synagogues, cemeteries, and beautiful cities with town squares and virtually no tourists. Boskovice is notable because not only does it have its old Czech town, but in the heart of this is a very well-preserved Jewish quarter. You can see a map of it here. Significantly, there's one big street that runs through it. And then off to the side, there was a synagogue, the Synagogue Maior, which you see here in red. There was a little smaller synagogue off to the side, but it's the Synagogue Maior, the big synagogue, dating from the 17th century that we're going to look at today. But first, I just want to take you a little bit around the town. We're looking down a street toward the synagogue here, and on the side are some of the buildings of the Jewish quarter, looking for the most part as they did when I first came here many decades ago, and this area was dilapidated and unrestored. Here is a group of people actually discovering this building, looking at this building, where a mikveh, or Jewish ritual bath, was found in 2004. And when I first visited Boskovice, most of the town looked like this, but now much of it is restored and quite pretty. The mikveh, which was discovered just when I was there in the basement of a house, it's not the primary mikveh of the town, but it was probably a private bath for the people in that building, is now also quite beautifully restored and accepts visitors. Only for looking, though, not for immersion. Here's a more typical view of the Jewish quarter as it looked in 2018 at the time of my last visit. And you can see that all the buildings have been restuccoed and painted, and it's all quite pretty. This building over here on the right is at a major intersection, and we'll see that in a minute. It was the place where Jews were gathered before they were deported to their deaths, first to Terezin and then to Auschwitz in 1942. The town is a tourist center now, and thousands of visitors come from all over the Czech Republic and all over Europe to see the sites. Much of the town is well marked, and the Jewish sites are well presented. This is part of a larger project that really encompasses all of the country, which promotes Jewish heritage, and over the last 20 years has resulted in the restoration of many, many important sites. Boskovice is one of 10 cities, the so-called 10 Stars project, where sites have been singled out. In fact, 15 historic buildings have been preserved in toto in these places. And with EU funding, these buildings have been restored, and exhibitions have been created telling the history of Czech Jewry, and touristic facilities have been included to really make all of the country a destination for visiting and learning about Czech Jewish history, so that people understand that the Jewish history of Bohemian Moravia was not just in Prague, but spread out everywhere, to every district, every town, every village across the country. This major intersection in the in the town, which you can see is quite pretty today, was a scene of tragedy. And there's a plaque here today that records the deportation of 458 Jews from Boskovice in March 1942 to the concentration camps, and few returned. So the 10 Stars project that I mentioned started back in the early 2000s, but really came to culmination in 2014 when all the sites were open. And this is a great route to travel. You can find information about it online, and there's guidebooks, and you can really see a lot of the country. And each synagogue that is included in one of these towns is quite different in its history, in its architectural style and decoration, and the kinds of exhibitions that are included. Boskovice is a little different than the other towns because there are two significant buildings included here. There's the synagogue, which we'll enter in just a few minutes, but there's also the former Jewish town hall, a big 19th century building, which was the center of communal life. And that has been restored. You see it here on the right. And this now contains a big exhibition about all of the Jewish quarters of the entire country. So in Boskovice, you can see the local history, but in this exhibition, you can get a sense of the breadth and variety of Jewish life over many centuries in Czech lands. Here's the synagogue, and it has a checkered history. It probably replaced an earlier wooden structure on this site when it was built in the early 17th century. We know that Jews were in Boskovice at least from the 14th century. It's quite possible they were passing through much earlier. The settlement was small, but it grew, and by 1639, a new masonry synagogue was erected by an Italian architect named Silvestr Fiota, who actually lived in Boskovice. He became Czech, so to speak. This synagogue still stands. It was expanded later in the 1600s by local builders, reconstructed in the 19th century, modernized, as we'll see, essentially whitewashed in the 1930s, and then left neglected and left to ruin after the deportation and murder of the Jewish community of Boskovice in the 1940s, until it was restored in the 1990s. It was returned to the Jewish community of Brno, and under their leadership, and particularly the architectural historian Jaroslav Konowski, it was meticulously restored over the course of about a decade. My own involvement in the synagogue begins about that time because I was then working for the World Monuments Fund in New York. I was running the Jewish Heritage Program, and the restoration of the synagogue in Boskovice was one of the first projects that we adopted. We didn't have a lot of money, but we were able to fund on an annual basis some of the work, and helping the community in Brno carry out the work, which they did so carefully, so meticulously, and you'll see the results in a minute. What is great about the synagogue is not so much the building, which is fine, but it's the decoration on the inside. We know from many sources that synagogues were richly decorated in the 16th and particularly 17th and 18th century and beyond. Some synagogues we have black and white photos from that were taken, in the interwar periods, especially between World War I and World War II. But rarely do we get to enjoy the, I'll say, splendiferous color that we're going to see in a minute as we walk in the door. And there were many decoration phases in this building, but for the most part, you don't have to worry about these different phases because they're all within about a century. And stylistically, although art historians will distinguish change, to our eye, they're very much of a piece, and they were painted pretty much from the 1650s through the 1750s, with most of the work being done in the second half of the 1600s or the 17th century. The restoration work that I talked about was remarkable, and what it found beneath whitewash that had been carried out in the 1930s and then after the war was remarkably preserved paintings on the walls and in the vaults. And these are some views of the synagogue before it was devastated, before it was closed in the war. And you can see the original, well, not the original, but the 20th century arrangement of seats and the central bema, the chandeliers, the carpets and the like. And you can see that the walls are mostly whitewashed, except for a few places where decoration is exposed. And that was the only decoration that was known or remembered when restoration began in 1989. And you can see that subsequently, most of the decoration that once covered the lower walls of the main sanctuary has been lost, but you're getting a hint right now, a first hint, that there's decoration in the walls higher up. The main hall, the main sanctuary is what we call a hall plan. It's just a single wall with no interruption. We're not having our view blocked by columns or piers. We're getting a nice big space where men can sit around what was probably a larger central bema with a higher railing or grill. This is all post restoration. This is all new work here, but it would have been located here in the center of the room. And then with the arc on the, it's really the southeast wall here, but we'll call it the east wall. We're a few steps up into an arc area. And much of the arc that we see today is from the 19th century. There would have been benches, though, all through the synagogue, as we saw in those earlier photos. The destruction is because rising damp, of course, rots the plaster and the paint is lost. So even with meticulous restoration, it couldn't be recovered. But the upper parts of the building, as we'll see, are quite well preserved. So that sanctuary we were in is this square space, roughly equals pretty much a square, equal sides, but it was preceded by a vestibule. The men would come in here. This was men's space only. And then they would come in from the south wall and then turn right into the sanctuary. Above the vestibule was a gallery for women, and they could sit there and look through narrow windows, similar to Prague and other places that we're familiar with, into the main hall. They didn't see much, they couldn't hear much, but they could be in the synagogue. The other parts, number 3 and 4 over here, these were added in the second phase, and the women's gallery was substantially expanded, and a new curving staircase was added to allow them to get to the upper floor. The building has a very tall wooden roof, and thankfully this was well maintained over the years. It's good for shedding water and snow, but it protects the vaults underneath. And it's these precious vaults over the main sanctuary that are the area of some of the most beautiful painting. And here is some of that painting. You'll excuse this panoramic view. I'm trying to show you as much as I can in one picture. It's not a very big space, but we'll look at more detail at some of these panels. Here you see a slightly higher view than the one before. So we're seeing the walls which contain prayers. This was sort of a poor man's sitter, if you will, people who didn't have printed prayer books. They did exist at the time, but they were still expensive and heirlooms that were passed down within families. People who didn't have those prayer books might know most of the prayers by heart, but they could also look at the walls for the text. And then painted vaults up above with important inscriptions. Most of the inscriptions in the little panels are donor inscriptions, and then in the larger panels are prayers. There are a couple of cycles of painting here, and they're overlaid. So the first one, the earlier one, is the most architectural, and it has these pediments and a framework of kind of a yellow, orange, red architecture. And then over this later is painted larger panels, mostly in black in a second phase. And then behind both of these are these glorious floral, these vegetal decorations with flowers and sometimes even birds and animals of many different types, many different species. Looking up the main hall, we see that it is laid out in kind of a pattern of panels. And this is a very typical arrangement in Baroque art in general, not just in the Jewish context. And we see it in French gardens, we see it in furniture design, and the panels are laid out following a sort of set geometry, but then within these, we have the fill of the glorious floral decoration, very much like a French flower garden, if you will. In the center, we have this rectangle with these little protruding semicircles, and then in the center is an oculus, a roundel from which a chandelier would have hung, and around this is a important inscription as well. So on the sides we get a donor inscriptions, and then we get these words that are sort of abstract words. This one is smut on the left. These are abbreviations, and any reasonably religiously literate person would probably know that these were abbreviations for well-known passages. In this case, this comes from Psalm 34. I confess I'm not so well educated. I have to look these things up. But at the time, it would have been second nature to know most of these passages by heart. And still today, among many observant Jews, this is the case. So we have more of these on the side. We have 4 of these all together. This is Atlas, it says there, and that is surely God is good to Israel from Psalm 73. But for me, as an art historian, it's the floral decoration that really makes this place sensational. The painters, had an exuberant style, very decorative, and really extolling beauty. So this is the idea of hidur mitzvah, of glorifying the commandment, of making a worship space and the ritual items within that space beautiful to behold. Above the arc wall is this long kind of passage, which is in praise of divine justice and for salvation. And then the arrangement of the letters at the beginning of the lines tells of a certain Jacob, son of Simon, who probably was the donor who funded this part of the construction or decoration.
Stan, I'm just stopping for a moment to remind you to move the cursor aside when you can.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
No, it's okay. It's also needed, but also it's so beautiful, and the cursor moving can be distracting.
Okay. So we see that donor portrait, donor inscription in the large rectangular space. And then if you look below it, you see a round window, and around the edge of the window is the inscription that tells us who the artist is. It was work done by the hands of Mordecai from Krakow and Maior of Zulz. And we know a bit about these painters. They also worked in the 17th century in Krakow, probably in the Isak Synagogue, where some of the style of painting is very similar. And it's believed that these painters from Krakow escaped to Moravia to really avoid many of the calamities affecting that part of southern Poland at the time, the Khmelnytsky invasions, and then later the Swedish invasions. So there's lots of turmoil in Krakow, lots of reasons for painters to get out of there when they can and find work in other places. So even though we're in the southeast of the Czech Republic, Czech lands, and Moravia, we're tied to this larger cultural renaissance, if you will, Jewish renaissance, using itinerant and local craftspeople that was flowering in Krakow at the time. I just show you a few details here. This beautiful vase with flowers that's in the corner of the vault, and then these gazelles who are running through the foliage. Just lovely, lovely depictions. The Ark is, as I said, rebuilt in the 19th century, but there are some fragments of the original, and particularly the two columns that flank the doors. And you can see they look a little unusual. They're columns that are sculpted in relief, and this gives you some idea of the decoration. It's very similar to the painted decoration with tendrils and leaves and animals. And if you look carefully, you can see a remarkable bird there on one of these columns flanking the Ark. Here we're looking down at the Ark through the window of the original women's section in the west, really the west wall, which is opposite, and you'll see there's some interesting painting we'll look at on this wall as well. So now we're looking up at the same spot. Those are the windows we just looked out of, and this balcony is a later addition. Originally, the hall would have been open, and you can see stylistically is quite unusual that it has these Doric, fluted Doric columns. This is more of a Greek revival introduction into this Renaissance, Gothic Renaissance structure with Baroque decoration. But I want you to look at the painting above it. You'll see there's one big panel on the right that says Shabbat, 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 and then has other attributes of the Sabbath written in smaller letters. But to the left of that, in the center of this area, there is a big menorah painted, and then off to the side of the left is the showbread table. This is from the description of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. We know that this work is painted by Maior, son of Yehuda Lieb, who signs it. And we're going to look at this in a little more detail. This type of depiction of implements from the tabernacle and from the temple is quite common in painted decorations in many, many synagogues. We actually have it continuing into the 20th century. A prayer hall in Bedzin in southern Poland was recently discovered with the same iconography, the same type of decoration. And this recreates the tabernacle, if you will, and the temple within the synagogue space. And it's a way to link the traditions of all of these Jewish worship spaces into one place. So like at the Passover Seder, when we think of ourselves leaving Egypt, so that's the Exodus, and it's a continuous process. It didn't just end in history, but it continues all the time, and we participate in it. So too, in the synagogue is part of this continuing process that begins with Exodus, begins with the tabernacle, continues with the temple, and then as Judaism is reinvented in the synagogue sanctuary too. Here's the showbread table. And then we look at prayers on the south wall, and it's a little changed because of the insertion of the balcony, but we can see these early panels with this very explicit architecture, these lovely columns sort of with entwined vines off to the side. They're very Baroque. They might recall to some of you the columns of the Baldacchino in St. Peter's in Rome. It's all part of the same artistic impulse, but we also have these types of decorations in the frontispieces of many printed Hebrew books. Some of the prayers you'll recognize. This is Yisker off to the right. And I think I have a detail. And this is Baruch Shemai here on the right, and there's Yisker on the left. So many of these are prayers that we're familiar with in the services still today, and you can go and read them and compare whether the texts that you know are identical to the ones they were reading and reciting in the 17th century. Here we're looking towards the north wall, and we can see how this has been changed. And here you see different patterns. The old decoration, the first decoration, which is the colorful one, is in the back, and then it was cut when the north extension was added and the women's gallery was put in there. And this new decoration of the black panels was added over the others. The restorers have shown parts of both, so it's a little confusing, but one overlays the other. And then coming up the stairs here in this picture, I didn't realize it was here, is my old friend Arno Pajic, who actually brought this project to the attention of the World Monuments Fund back at a conference in 1990 in New York. And Arno, at that time, was curator of the Jewish Museum in Prague. He is recently retired, but he is one of the leading authority on synagogues in Prague. And he and Jaroslav Klanovsky together have done more to expand the study of Czech synagogues than anyone, and they're both played an important part in the restoration of this building. So here are just some views of some of the other decoration, and now we're going to go upstairs into the women's gallery. It was the women's gallery that actually was first exposed, and here we see some more inscriptions, a central medallion for a chandelier. One thing I asked from the Lord, this only do I seek, from Psalm 27, and more details. But now let's look at the beautiful fruit and flowers that fill the spaces. More views from the women's gallery. And if you can see on that wall at the end of this image, there are several medallions where these medallions, which are donor inscriptions, are flanked by lions and birds. Quite beautiful to look at. Look at these lions. Now, many of you are familiar with lions holding up the 10 Commandments on the top of arks or on the front of a parochet. The lion, of course, is the people of Israel. It's the protector of Israel. In this case, it's elevating the donors, giving them status by holding their name in a wreath. I love these red tongues which dart out from the lion's mouth, really quite dramatic. And we have parrots. Parrots were very popular in the Baroque period, exotic animals coming from Africa and South America, filling the birdhouses at the estates of the wealthy. And all of these animals are always signs of God's creation, the multitude of species. So they can be interpreted as something emblematic of contemporary taste, but also you can give it a religious gloss as well. Just a few more views through the gallery. You'll note that in the women's gallery, all the prayers are given vowels. So it's a little bit easier for women at the time to read, and it's a lot easier for people like me who were raised in that tradition as well. I can't do much with an Israeli newspaper, but I can make my way through a prayer book with vowels. And here we find more views and more birds. I love this bird, a dove amidst the flowers. And these flowers here on these tendrils, it almost as if they're flowers, but also birds with spread wings seen from above. Just lovely painting. And that takes us to the end of the view of the Boskovice Synagogue. Of course, we've only looked at it for a very short time today, and I urge you to go and visit and spend several hours. If you love art, you'll be entranced looking at all the details. If you know your Jewish service, your liturgy, know your prayers, you can also spend a lot of time comparing your experience to the religious experience of the people who worshiped here for many hundreds of years. So thank you for this, for joining me on this little journey. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time when we visit another one of my favorite Jewish spaces and places around the world.